Amid the heavy, charged air at Fairmont Crest, an old clause suddenly binds Nicole and Ted to the same signature within 48 hours, unleashing a chain of secrets, rumors, and an anonymous audio clip that could overturn every ounce of trust. In today's video, we'll unlock why their reunion isn't about the heart but a survival pact between two people who've both been betrayed, from a smear clip dropped at the exact hour, to hidden transaction trails buried beneath room schedules, and an independent committee poised to expose an entire manipulation machine. Get ready for razor-sharp details: who's pulling Leslie's strings, whether Carlton is a pawn or a player, and if that muffled voice truly belongs to Ted. If you crave cool, calculated drama full of schemes and brutal decisions, don't look away. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next part, where every reflection could be a trap, and a single signature might decide their fate. The closed-door meeting at Fairmont Crest began with a silence thick with power and suspicion, but Nicole's sudden arrival turned the room into an invisible minefield where every step could detonate. Ted, prepared for a decisive confrontation, was forced to swallow his anger like a jagged stone when the fund's attorney read out an old addendum left by a late advisor, a cold legal chain that locked them both into a single choice: either co-sign within 48 hours for any major amendments related to Leslie and Anita's inheritance, or let an automatic penalty clause trigger, unleashing a domino effect that would scour their reputations, their assets, and everything they once protected. There was no space for pride, no prize for maintaining poise, only a narrow corridor that bound two former partners turned skeptics, a coerced compromise. Nicole stood like a fissure in glass, so composed it unsettled the others around the table, yet inside she was molten, spasming with anger held down by force. Memories of a divorce pushed to the brink, the image of herself crushed by articles and whispers and dirty tactics that no one owned. She hadn't come to plead, nor to reconcile, she had come to set a knife in the center of the table and remind everyone that if blood were to spill, it would run along the trench of justice she intended to carve for herself. Ted listened to the time markers roll from the attorney's mouth like a countdown humming behind his skull. 48 hours was not merely a deadline, it was a compressed tribunal, each second forcing him to navigate two opposing poles, protecting the company from collapse and admitting the risky agreements he had once signed in the dark to save it, secrets that could grind down any attempt at cleansing his name if dragged out at the wrong moment. He saw in Nicole a chill he had once called resolve, now a steel shield that reflected everything he refused to face. Love had no voice here, only obligation, injury, and the dull roar of a split pride. In her calm he recognized a familiar glint, the tenacity of a survivor, bartered at the cost of a heart that no longer believed belated explanations. He knew that if he spoke of the choices made in crisis, he would be judged not by law but by the gaze of someone who had once entrusted him with everything, and that sentence would be heavier than any damages. The rumor of Nicole's rekindling, subtly scattered by Leslie like a fine powder, settled on every shoulder and storyline around Fairmont Crest before anyone realized what they had breathed in. It was not merely psychological warfare, it was a campaign to shape perception, a staged narrative designed to make the world believe Nicole had returned only to exploit Ted and bend the fund to her will. Cropped photographs, insinuating posts, anonymous calls, all of it pressed Nicole into the far corner of a room whose walls were funhouse mirrors. She grasped Leslie's motive at once. If the co-signature clause was the rope binding her to Ted, then slandering her name was the quickest path to transform that rope into a noose, leaving them gasping even as they tried to stand tall. Yet Leslie misread, or willfully underestimated, the endurance of patience heated by humiliation. Nicole did not need to justify herself, she needed proof, and she began to touch the live wires she once thought belonged only to opportunists. Anita stepped out of her own gray zone with an unexpected move. She handed Nicole a copy of an internal log, whispers of tampered meeting schedules, budget allocations for media pushes, faint indications of an orchestrated sequence that ran exactly through the period when Nicole and Ted's marriage cracked. Anita was no angel, she was simply lucid enough to understand that when the fire licks the hem of the curtains, survival depends less on oaths of loyalty than on standing in the path of truth one step before the rest. The document pricked Nicole's skin like a needle, pulling scattered doubts into a shape she could finally sketch. The divorce had been staged by altered calendars, last-minute room changes, and half-truths inflated into public verdicts. Nicole's anger did not thunder, it seeped like acid, eating through layers of uncertainty until only the bare framework of a plot remained. When the encrypted emails resurrected a single initial, seed like a ghost from the past, Nicole's stomach cinched into a knot. Carlton had surfaced beside her after the divorce, both life wrapped in stone, and now the pieces clicked together in that hateful way of truths arriving late, murky transfers, smear campaigns fixed on Ted, anonymous sermons about ethics and loyalty. If Carlton was a pawn, whose hand moved him? If he was a player, who was the true target? The questions did not slow Nicole's hands, they honed her fury into a spear, and all she needed was a straight enough arc to throw. Ted watched Nicole comb through transaction histories the way a forensic doctor reassembles a body from fragments, and he understood that evasion had reached its limit. This war could not be won with silence. It demanded a confession, not to beg for forgiveness but to redraw the map of trust on cracked concrete. He opened the drawer he had kept locked, the risky agreement signed on a night when loans were poised to avalanche, paper that could be titled either salvage or self-incrimination, depending on the eye that read it. Laying that truth on the table changed the air between them, not softer, not lighter, but less opaque. Late honesty could not erase scars, it could, however, smother a blaze that might otherwise devour them both. Nicole did not forgive, she acknowledged a rare courage in a man who had chosen quiet for too long. Then she set her condition, not as a former lover reclaiming fairness, but as a provisional ally writing rules of war. They would sign together, turn every stone together, and hunt down the hand that pushed their marriage into fog and laughed from behind the curtain. They began like miners descending a shaft, headlamps slicing tunnels that led to a shell account tied to Fairmont Crest itself. One anomalous transfer surfaced like a shadow on the very night the divorce was filed, perfectly aligned with a sudden bloom of filth about Nicole in the press. The trail was not loud, but it was sharp, money routed through idle intermediaries to a cold wallet that woke only on their most sensitive days. The conclusion that gnawed at them was stark: whoever had touched the system did not stand outside it. The conductor moved silently from within, hands-on access to room schedules, file staging, and the choreography of meetings hidden in plain sight. On the day they were to present the co-signature to the press, Nicole took a shot aimed at her softest flank. A spliced video knifed across the surface of her poise, smearing her private life with cheap materials and brutal efficiency, threatening to turn their sober, meticulous efforts into a public farce. At the edge of the stage, hungry eyes cheered for spectacle. In the center, Nicole felt the air thin, as if the room had been vacuum sealed. She could retreat, barter the clause for silence, let public noise settle like sediment. But she had not come to preserve comfort, she had come to resist arrangement. Ted, seeing the fork in the road, chose the path that would carve a deep groove in the terrain of honor. He stepped into the line of fire, took ownership of communications, and stood beside Nicole to declare a joint defense of the fund's transparency, not as a cosmetic gesture but as a shield large enough to keep her from shouldering the blast alone. He understood that if Nicole absorbed the full force, the war would end not in legal defeat but in spiritual collapse. In a forgotten office at the end of the North Corridor, Nicole found a handwritten letter Ted had composed at the breaking point of their marriage but never sent. It did not beg or excuse, it mapped fear of manipulation, of losing control when rooms turned cold and handshakes evaporated at the exact moments he needed a witness. The letter felt like a bone healed crooked, reminding its holder that pain does not always equal weakness, sometimes it is simply the echo of a blow landed without warning. Nicole did not soften, she placed the page in the larger frame of the truth, and the picture grew less distorted. The cruelty she had reserved for herself lightened by a notch, allowing her to decide with less rancor and more strategy. The clandestine meeting with Carlton became a trial by fire for her trust in her own instincts. The outcome remained offstage, but data do not lie. His name vanished from the ledgers soon after, leaving behind a single line urging her to look toward the room scheduler. Nicole despised half directions, yet she had long since learned that masterminds nest where we assume harmlessness. The scheduling assistant, a role so small it gets brushed away like dust on a banister, suddenly stood at the crossroads of every access point: calendars, secure rooms, files awaiting signature, urgent reschedulings allegedly demanded by executives. Payments through intermediaries fell into this person's account in eerie sync with the flare-ups of scandal. The pieces clicked with a complaint of metal, and Nicole tasted bitterness like a coin on her tongue. The largest betrayals are often executed by the gloved hands of those who seem serviceable and clean. When Nicole and Ted faced the press, they did not speak in the language of reconciliation or romance, they used the stripped dialect of discipline and control. An independent oversight committee was announced like a blade trimming the rancid fat from the system, anchored to a 7-day window for any insider to confess before the files were hauled beneath the cold light of public scrutiny. This was not performative, it was a declaration born of exhaustion reaching its limit, patience hardening into a filtration mechanism. In the brief instant when lenses caught their hands clasped, no one saw a vow renewed, they saw a soldier's pact, scars set side by side as boundary lines. In Nicole's eyes flashed two contradictory beams, the flinty determination of someone who will not bend, and the raw injury of a woman repeatedly shaved down to fit other people's frames. Backstage, as the media noise receded, an anonymous message dropped into Nicole's phone like an arrow skimming the stage after the curtain fell. The words were few but sufficient to buckle a newly raised wall: the cosigner is not a victim. The silence afterward weighed like lead, and the attached recording added another layer of metal, an indistinct but familiar male voice speaking of trading for the family's quiet. Nicole felt her lower abdomen tighten, less fear than the reflex of discovering a deeper rung on a well she had believed already bottomed out. If the voice was genuine, it would warp every line she had drafted; if fabricated, it proved the enemy had graduated to a more meticulous cruelty, meaning the war had entered a colder chapter. Nicole's anger did not burst outward, it compacted into a dense, sharp mass lodged at the center of her chest, both choking and bracing her. She recognized that this game had never revolved around love or hate, it pivoted on the definition of control, and each player would have to choose between the safety of silence and the risk of truth. Confronted by the insinuation of the audio, Ted was likewise forced to stare into his own shadow, the version of himself that might have placed family stability above the invisible cost paid by the one beside him, whether he had done it or not, whether the voice was his or a deft forgery. He understood that any defense now would be suspect, and that trust is not revived by promises but by a sequence of acts tested mercilessly over time. The 48 hours of the co-signature had stretched into a longer suspended sentence, each day an experiment, each night a cross-examination not of the other, but of their worst selves. As the committee began peeling back layers of data, Nicole rearranged her emotional chessboard with the economy of someone who has stopped being naive. She placed the handwritten letter in an unlocked drawer, a reminder that tenderness is not the enemy, but gullibility is. She maintained the partnership with Ted, not for romance but for fact; only the two of them had both motive and wound deep enough to keep digging. Leslie, facing the 7-day countdown, made sloppier moves, feeding the rumor mill with a haste that smelled burnt, revealing more than it concealed. Anita, with eyes broken in on the dark of closed rooms, chose her perch not between the factions but where she could see the field and leap at the exact moment a bridge cracked beneath one of them. The scheduling assistant, once keeper of keys for others, felt the loop tighten around their wrists and began committing tiny errors, the kind that an independent committee calls a pattern, and that Nicole calls a fingerprint. If no one confesses, the door to public files will swing open, and the war will shift from personal failings to structural rot, a landscape where everyone fears a machine cold enough to crush both puppeteer and puppet. Nicole did not fear that machinery, she feared only the possibility of softening at the moment cruelty would be necessary. So she wrapped her anger like a blade in a sleeve, ready to draw at the flicker that announces a fresh deceit. Ted did the same with his private shame, tying it like a pebble to a cord so that, when needed, he could drop it down the abyss to measure how deep this pit ran. What they had done wrong did not annul their right to do the next thing right, but that right would be revoked the instant they hesitated again. And in the quiet dark between two heartbeats, they shared a single understanding: whatever reunion awaits them is not the closing chorus of a love story, but a survival treaty between two besieged fighters inside a citadel of mirrors, where each reflection could be a trap and each breath a vow to keep moving, even if what lies ahead is not light but a deeper tier of shadow, one that will demand more flesh, and force them to snap another layer of pride before their fingers can finally touch the truth. As the lights at Fairmont Crest dim, what remains isn't a neat answer but the veins of truth just beginning to surface beneath the thin skin of the system. The co-signature clause placed Nicole and Ted in the same frame, but the price is a silent vow to keep their hands steady while the blade grazes their throats. Rumors of a rekindling may skew the public's view, yet the transaction trails and room schedules remind us that every stage play needs someone to pull the backdrop. Leslie may be the front line of the smear campaign, Anita may pivot at the precise moment, and Carlton may vanish like interference on a screen, but the real key still lies where everyone wanders past without looking, the keeper of the backstage clock, the one who touches every time slot, every door, every file awaiting a signature. The independent committee is in motion, the 7-day deadline is counting down, and with each passing minute another link tightens around the necks of those who believe justice could be manipulated with a few clever scheduling tricks. The anonymous audio clip could be a simple splice job or a drill aimed straight at the small flame of trust that has just flickered back to life between two people who once meant everything to each other. Either way, it forces both Nicole and Ted to confront their private darkness, the line between protecting the family and grinding down the heart standing beside you, the line between raw truth and a finely tailored code of morality meant to lull the crowd to sleep. No single handclasp can absolve the past, but it can score a boundary on cold stone. From here on, every concession must be paid for with evidence, and every promise must be proven through time's harsh abrasion. If next week is the moment the files are laid bare to the public, then tomorrow is already the most brutal internal culling, where tiny discrepancies harden into the perpetrator's signature, and a minor slip can send the entire edifice crashing down. And if the muffled voice in that recording truly belongs to Ted, the quake will strike not only the two of them but also the audience's faith in the idea of sacrifice for the greater good. If it is a sophisticated forgery, the one behind it has shown a willingness to play a blood chess game with every second of public attention. So when the screen closes on Nicole's gaze, steadfast and wounded, take it as a warning: this reunion was never a happy ending, but a survival pact between two warriors. We'll be back for the next turning points, when the committee drops its first batch of data, when the scheduler's facade cracks, when Carlton leaves another breadcrumb, and when Leslie pays for a hasty move. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where a single camera pan can catch a betraying blink, where one dot on a ledger can shake a tower of power, and where one signature, only one, can erase the line between salvation and self-destruction.